Something that I've noticed when talking to my schoolmates about what subjects they like, or what they'd like to do for a career in the future, is that most of them fall into one of two categories. Either they're a science guy who's interested in maths, physics, engineering, all that sort of stuff, and they're probably planning on becoming a doctor or a scientist or a banker or one of any number of jobs where they're going to be number crunching and logging data for the rest of their lives. And then the other camp is the arty guy who likes art, drama, English, music, all the humanities, and wants to grow up to become a poet, or a painter, or a singer, and spend the rest of their lives taking recreational drugs and thinking up a new way to express themselves. Now, obviously, that's not the only two types of student. There are many other people who like neither of these things, like people who want to be athletes, historians, lawyers, but for the most part, I find that these two groups are the predominant ones. And there tends to be a lot of conflict between these two groups as well, with art people being seen by the science people as these lazy, overly liberal morons who are either not focused or not intelligent enough to grasp these scientific concepts, and the science people being seen as stuffy, boring fuddy-duddies who wouldn't know a free spirit if it punched them in the face. So there you have it, that's my interpretation of the modern student body, with the academics in the red corner and the artists in the blue, ready to duke it out, while all the other little groups just try to stay out of the way. But caught in the middle of these two are those people who like both science and art, who don't really see why the two are considered at odds against each other, and wonder why this divide even exists in the first place. I myself fall into this category, and I have to say that although I acknowledge that the two might be different, that doesn't mean that they're complete opposites. I mean, there has to be some overlap between the two, doesn't there? And that's why I'm here today. To do my best to answer this question, or at the very least, to present my thoughts on it. Where is the art in science? And where is the science in art? Now, I'd like to start by talking about something called the lateralization of brain function, which is essentially just a fancy word for the idea that we've all heard before about the left and right sides of the brain. And it all comes from the work of this guy called Roger W. Sperry, because if you look at the brain, you'll notice that it's split pretty neatly into two halves by a line called the longitudinal fissure. And what Mr. Sperry did was he decided to try to treat sufferers of epilepsy by literally cutting the brain in two halves along this line. And the treatment was partially successful. Sufferers found that their seizures were either greatly reduced or completely eliminated, but they also began to develop additional symptoms. For example, when a patient was presented with a word through their left eye, meaning it would then be processed by the right half of the brain, they found themselves unable to recognize it. But when the situation was reversed, they didn't have such troubles. This led Sperry to conclude that the left and right side of the brain both process information in very different ways, and over the course of several similar tests, he came to the conclusion that the left half is the one that deals with stuff like language, logic, writing, analytic functions, all the things that we usually think of as being related to science or math, while the right half is more connected to things like creativity, emotion, intuition, stuff that we associate with the arts. And this representation of the brain is one that survives to this day. You still hear people talking about being left-brain thinkers or right-brain thinkers, and see books like Thinking with the Right Side of the Brain. But while this theory might seem to decisively prove that science and art are worlds apart on the fundamental level of how we think about them, the fact is it's not actually as simple as Mr. Sperry thought. While it is true that brain activity for certain skills shows dominance in either half of our brain, it's not as divided as Mr. Sperry decided. The fact of the matter is that these two halves have to collaborate in order to do the work as best as they can. For example, while the left side might specialize in picking up the sounds that form the words of language, the right half is necessary for picking up emotional nuances and minute stresses of language. And it's only through the cooperation of these two halves of the brain that communication is possible. They have to work together in order to function. And I think that we can see this reflected in art and science, because the best artists will always have an element of logic to their work, just as the greatest scientists are those whose creativity and intuition allows them to see an answer that nobody else even thought to look for. Now, what I find to be the perfect example of how this collaboration between art and science can lead to greatness is that of Leonardo da Vinci. Now, da Vinci is widely known to be an incredibly talented artist, but he's also famous as a visionary engineer and scientist. His notebooks are filled with sketches and thumbnails for his paintings and sculptures, but also with designs for machines, bridges, and studies of human anatomy and physiology. And this was because, to him, there was no difference between art and science. If Leonardo wanted to paint people, then he decided that the best way to do that was by studying how people are constructed. And not just from an artist's perspective of drawing skeletons and muscles, but he really wanted to attain a scientific understanding of how the body works. And we can see this reflected in his journals. His sketches on skeletons and muscles, they're not just artistic studies, but they're research notes from dissections of human corpses. And while professional doctors at the time still believed that leeches were an acceptable form of treatment, Da Vinci was years, decades ahead of their development. He was an artist, yet he was studying the circulatory, reproductive, and vascular systems, and he was actually figuring out how these organs work. His studies on the mechanics of skeletons and muscles, actually, is very close to the level of some modern biomechanics. But more than just anatomical studies, he was also a very capable engineer, and everybody knows about his famous inventions, particularly his flying machines. And when, in 2003, some of the inventions from his designs were built and tested, it was found, actually, that some of them worked very, very well. And this demonstrated that he had an understanding of concepts like air resistance and gravity. Yet despite his focus on science, he was also one of the greatest artists who has ever lived. And I really think that it was Da Vinci's understanding of both science and art, and his acceptance that he could study both, that led to this greatness. Because he was able to apply the concepts from science to his art, and that was what made his art great. Just as he was able to apply the creativity from his art and apply that to his work in science, and make that great. And through the life of Da Vinci, I think we really see how great the collaboration of art and science can be. And this isn't just limited to Da Vinci, it's a phenomenon that we can actually see all across the board. It's why Einstein famously said that imagination is more important than knowledge, because what he was trying to say was that just as important to scientific discovery as knowing the facts is having the creativity to interpret the facts in a different way. Thinking about it like an artist will allow you to see the solution where nobody else does. And it's also why the training of an artist is so rigid and formulaic, because in order to create truly great art, you have to think about it like a scientist. You have to apply logic and formulas to it. Because in my opinion, there really isn't any difference between science and art. They're both different manifestations of that same part of the human condition. The thirst for knowledge. We want to understand things, and whether we do this through trying to understand ourselves by producing art, or by trying to understand the world around us by producing science, it's all the same. Art and science aren't really two different disciplines at all. What they are is two different paths that will ultimately lead to the same destination. In response to the question, where is the art in science, and where is the science in art, I would say that science and art are fundamentally connected. It's not about trying to add science to art, or add art to science. It's about trying to find a happy medium between the two. Because in my opinion, art is omnipresent in science, and science is omnipresent in art.